declare that we are one nation under God. We might structure our civil affairs such that on the one day in 7, which God has deemed holy, we rest from our work and worship Him. This civil and public acknowledgement should certainly be formalized in our governing documents.
The only way to start the return to moral order in this country is by force. It's the only way. It's the only way. It has to be by force, at least for a time. We have to regulate morality by force, at least for a time. It's literally the only solution. And people have to start to realize that it is the faith in God, Christian understanding of morality, it has to be the foundation. And this is not going to be done by choice.
Dear friends, as a long-term sponsor of the European Sunday Alliance, I'm proud to support the goal of ensuring the work-free Sunday. A synchronized week time of rest is very important in our fast-paced world. I encourage all stakeholders to jointly continue our efforts to turn the idea of a synchronized day of rest into reality.
Jakob Wertz was a true and rare musical phenomenon. Not only could he play more than a dozen instruments with ease, but he was also a brilliant virtuoso pianist. He had over 10,000 musical pieces committed to memory. Bach, Scarlatti, Beethoven, no problem. Whatever anyone named, he would immediately play it from memory, flawlessly, without ever needing to glance at sheet music. Born in 1924, Wertz crafted a unique and deeply personal musical style that blended classical music with touches of jazz and popular melodies. It was a fusion of genres, bold, elegant, and masterfully executed. One day, David Kapp, a music producer at Kapp Records, happened to hear him playing in the grand lobby of the Madison Hotel in Manhattan, New York. Overwhelmed by the beauty of the performance, he instantly offered him a recording contract. Since his full name was difficult to recall, Louis Jakob Wertz adopted a stage name. He chose Roger Williams to honor the man he deeply admired, the reformer and founder of Rhode Island. Like his namesake, he was also a man of sincere, humble faith, the son of a Lutheran pastor. Once in an interview he said, "I know I received a gift. Sometimes I go to church just to quietly thank the Creator, while I express my gratitude and faith through my fingers, in my music." So why am I sharing this with you, dear listener? Because I strongly suspect that if I did a random street survey, I wouldn't find a single person who's heard of Roger Williams, the American religious reformer. And it wouldn't matter if I were in Warsaw, Amsterdam, Poznan, or Washington, D.C. Perhaps some devoted music lovers would recognize the name from piano pieces by Louis Jakob Wertz, stage name Williams. But the reformer himself? Forgotten. And that's truly a shame, because it's a rich, fascinating story. And since no one else seems eager to tell it, I'll gladly be the one, even if only a few kind souls are listening.
In the promulgation of the principles of Protestantism and in the work of the Reformation, the names of Martin Luther and Roger Williams can never rightly be separated. Williams completed what Luther began, and together they gave anew to the world, and for all time, the principles originally announced by him, who was the author and finisher of the faith of both, Jesus Christ, the author of religious liberty.
Danuta Waniek, in her book The Altar Without a Throne, recalls a speech by John Paul II addressed to the authorities of the People's Republic of Poland. The Pope openly challenged the principle of the separation of church and state.
The Church, he argued, cannot be confined solely to the sphere of religious worship. On the contrary, it has both the right and the duty to be involved in all areas of social life. This, he asserted, stems from its very nature.
The founding fathers of the United States of America, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Adams, and others, wrote into the Constitution the principle of the separation of church and state. The First Amendment reads as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These men knew exactly where the union of church and state leads. They were well aware of Europe's bloody history and wanted no such tyranny in America. The pioneers longed for a church without a pope and a state without a king on a papal leash. Everyone has heard of the founding fathers of the United States, but the true author behind this entire concept has been completely overlooked and forgotten. Thomas Jefferson emphasized that the idea behind the First Amendment to the US Constitution was inspired by the works of Roger Williams. The First Amendment is the foundation of freedom not only in the USA, but across the world. And today, that principle is under widespread attack. The rest of the world gradually aligned itself with the ideals of the American Constitution. Certain things simply weren't done because Americans didn't do them. And if some country did allow such things, its citizens would flee to America, if they were lucky enough to escape. America and its ideals were a sanctuary of liberty, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But there came a time when Americans began locking people up without trial, in Guantanamo. Worse still, they openly and shamelessly used torture to extract confessions. And the world began to change. Americans showed that the ideals of their Constitution were nothing more than dots and dashes on the page of a national document. They meant absolutely nothing. Others began to follow their example. We all remember, I think, the wholesale late-night passage of bizarre laws in the Polish parliament. So politicians around the world stopped caring about their own constitutions, an unnecessary burden. This is the papal way of managing human material. This is tyranny, a totalitarian religious social feudalism of Roman Catholicism, the place we are quickly heading towards. And just as politicians stopped caring about their constitutions, so too will they stop caring about freedom of conscience. It is inevitable. We've already seen what happened in the years 2020 to 2022. That was a warning bell. Sadly, one that was almost universally ignored. I think it's worth reminding ourselves what Roger Williams wrote about this.
God requireth not a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state, which enforced uniformities sooner or later is the greatest occasion of civil war. Ravishing of conscience, persecution of Christ Jesus in his servants, and the hypocrisy and destruction of millions of souls. King James, in his Majesty's speech in Parliament, 1609, saith, "It is a sure rule in divinity that God never loves to plant his church by violence and bloodshed. I gave good proof that I intend no persecution against them for conscience cause, but only desire to be secured for civil obedience, which for conscience cause they are bound to perform." Secondly, the saying of Stephen, King of Poland, "I am a king of men, not of conscience, a commander of bodies, not souls." So that once more we do profess before God and the whole world that from this time forward we are firmly resolved not to persecute or molest or suffer to be persecuted or molested any person whosoever for matter of religion.
It was a beautiful declaration by King James, the protector of Protestantism. But history unfolded differently. Roger Williams was born in London around 1603. He came from a very poor family, but he was lucky. A well-known lawyer and politician, Sir Edward Coke, noticed the young man's great talents early on. He took him under his wing and provided him with an excellent education at the University of Cambridge.
In 1612, a vast conflux of people watched Bartholomew Leggett, a separatist who completely rejected the Church of England, burn to ashes in London, while the bells of William's nearby parish church, St Sepulchre's, tolled in doleful celebration. Also in 1612, Edward Whiteman, another separatist, was burned at the stake in Lichfield.
Young Williams grew up in this heavy atmosphere. From an early age, he encountered people persecuted for their beliefs. His mentor, Sir Edward Coke, walked a thin line as he publicly demanded respect for the English Magna Carta. This legal document from 1215 was a milestone in the fight for civil liberties and freedom of conscience. In it, King John guaranteed, "No man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by lawful judgment." The Magna Carta's provisions were the first rays of modern constitutionalism. But the road to freedom was still long and winding. Let me tell you that in general, I'm a quiet guy. I usually don't talk much. People bore me a bit. I like my old books. But there are some people I'd really like to talk to. And I think Roger and I would be on the same wavelength. I downloaded a dusty scan of Williams's book, The Bloody Tenant, from a digital library. The man fascinated me.
Luther, in his book about the civil magistrate, saith, "The laws of the civil magistrate's government extend no further than over the body or goods, and to that which is external. For over the soul God will not suffer any man to rule. Only he himself will rule there. Wherefore, whosoever doth undertake to give laws unto the souls and consciences of men, he usurpeth that government himself, which appertaineth unto God."
How did Roger Williams come to understand true unity? He didn't understand it in the sense of modern ecumenism, where no articles of faith exist. It's incredible how clearly he understood what biblical Israel truly is.
The people of Israel were all the seed or offspring of one man, Abraham, and so downward the seed of Isaac and Jacob, hence called the Israel of God, that is, wrestlers and prevailers with God, distinguished into 12 tribes, all sprung out of Israel's loins. But now few nations of the world but are a mixed seed, the people of England especially, the Britons, Picts, Romans, Saxons, Danes, and Normans. By a wonderful providence of God, being become one English people, only the spiritual Israel and seed of God, the newborn, but one. Christ is the seed, and they only that are Christ's are only Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise.
Beautiful, isn't it? Spot on. The Puritans criticised the Church of England for creating an episcopal Catholic-style system of church hierarchy and for imposing on believers the Book of Common Prayer. No personal prayer was acceptable under that system. Anyone who prayed to God in their own words was prosecuted by state law. The only prayer allowed was the one found exclusively in the Book of Common Prayer. It was the official, universal prayer book, just like in Catholicism. The Puritans, people shaped by Calvinist theology, wanted to reform the pagan sentiments of the Church of England. And what do you think? Were they popular? Not at all. They were mockingly called Puritans. People laughed, saying they wanted to be purer than pure. Queen Elizabeth at times tolerated the Puritans, and at other times persecuted them.
To assure loyalty to both the Crown and the Church, Parliament required all office holders, all members of Parliament, all priests, and even all university students to swear the Oath of Supremacy, stating, "I do utterly testify and declare in my conscience to affirm the monarch as the only supreme governor of the realm, as well as in all spiritual or ecclesiastical things or causes as temporal. So help me God." With the Act of Uniformity, Parliament also required all subjects to attend weekly worship at their parish church. Recusancy, failure to attend worship, or even refusal to participate in the full liturgy became a crime and a subversive act.
In England, after the Catholic Bloody Mary, the reign of Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, begins. Despite her close ties with John Dee, an occultist and expert in Enochian magic, Elizabeth bases her rule on Protestantism. By the way, the famous agent 007 actually has his roots with John Dee. He used to sign his letters with the triple digits 007. Ian Fleming, a member of the esoteric Ordo Templi Orientis, knew this very well and named his agent accordingly. Anyway, John Dee, alongside Agrippa, Paracelsus, Roger Bacon, Ficino, Nostradamus, and Nicholas Flamel, among other mystics, is one of the most famous occultists in history. During Elizabeth's reign, Parliament passed the Second Act of Supremacy. The first had been under Henry VIII. This act established the monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England, a kind of king pope. The crown rose above the conscience of the people. Papal tyranny was replaced by Protestant tyranny. The Book of Common Prayer became the official prayer book of the national church. As I mentioned before, anyone who prayed in their own words faced trouble, such a person became a criminal. The Book of Common Prayer was a violation of conscience. The Anglicans went even further. A person who was not an ordained clergyman of the national church was not allowed to preach the gospel. If he insisted and did so anyway, he was subject to severe secular punishment. Queen Elizabeth loved splendour and grand ceremonies. In this, she was closer to Roman Catholicism than to biblical modesty. She could not stand the thought that anyone might limit her when it came to the rich garments of the clergy and outward displays of magnificence. She hated the Scottish reformer John Knox, as well as the Puritans. She confiscated their property, threw them in prison, and even spilled their blood. She secured her throne upon the gospel, but at the same time, she didn't allow it to reach farther than the end of her sceptre. During her reign, known as the so-called Elizabethan Golden Age, the Reformation of the Church of England came to a standstill. However, this wasn't a particularly methodical attempt to eradicate the movement. The Protestant king, King James I, with his absolutist tendencies, even posed a threat to the Magna Carta. He took the matter of Puritans seriously as well. The Anglican Church became a state religion, a Protestant version of Catholicism, a union of church and crown. Nevertheless, James did allow Puritan scholars to participate in the translation committee for the English Bible, and that deserves praise. He took his absolutist ambitions to absurd levels. Those who presented a document to the king had to approach him on their knees and weren't even allowed to look at him. Now that's ego. James believed in the doctrine of the divine right of kings, that some are born to rule, and others to be ruled, to be subjects. This aligned with his Calvinist sentiments. In the Old Testament, we have a glimpse of what this doctrine of divine right looks like in practice. The divine right to govern.
Jezebel, his wife, said, "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite that he refused to sell to you. He is no longer alive, but dead."
Some claim that Christ said nothing about politics. As we've seen earlier, he provided us with the most precise definition of the separation of church and state. He also spoke further on political matters. His disciples constantly argued about who among them was the greatest, even during the Last Supper. They did so to such an extent that Jesus rose from the table, girded himself with a towel, and began to wash the disciples' feet himself. This was a task typically performed by servants and slaves. Imagine the burning shame that engulfed the disciples, except for Judas, of course. Nothing seemed to affect him. This mindset, who among us is the greatest, is the spirit of the papacy and also a fallen Protestantism. It's the malevolent fate behind these systems. It's the spirit of the Antichrist. On one occasion, Jesus said to his agitated disciples,
"Ye know that they which are accounted to rule over the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and their great ones exercise authority upon them. But so shall it not be among you. but whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister. In the kingdoms of the world, position meant self-aggrandizement. The people were supposed to exist for the benefit of the ruling classes. Influence, wealth, education were so many means of gaining control of the masses for the use of the leaders. The higher classes were to think, decide, enjoy, and rule. The lower were to obey and serve. Religion, like all things else, was a matter of authority. The people were expected to believe and practice as their superiors directed. The right of a man, as man, to think and act for himself was wholly unrecognized. Christ was establishing a kingdom on different principles. He called men not to authority, but to service. The strong to bear the infirmities of the weak. Power, position, talent, education place their possessor under the greater obligation to serve his fellows.
Roger Williams often repeated a thought previously expressed by his guardian and mentor, Sir Edward Coke. Cogitationis poenam nemo emeret. No man can be punished for his thoughts. Contrary to popular belief, the right to freedom of speech and conscience is not the achievement of the Enlightenment philosophers, atheists, or the French Revolution. Atheism, in fact, excels at attributing to itself thoughts and ideas it did not originate, an arrogant copy and paste. In atheist countries, possessing a Bible is either prohibited or heavily restricted. Currently, the Chinese have entirely rewritten the Bible according to the principles of atheism. Williams named his daughter Freeborn, born to be free. The reformer knew well the price of this freedom. He saw his mentor, Edward Coke, being led to the Tower for daring to defend freedom of speech and conscience in England. Previously, he had opposed the absolutist ambitions of the Protestant king, King James I. Roger Williams realized that he had said and written too much, and there was no turning back. Everyone knew his views, and unfortunately, remaining in the country meant imprisonment. In prison, he would certainly have been subjected to torture. His ears would have been cut off, and his tongue pierced, creating a large hole. Imprisonment would have been for life, which wasn't difficult given the conditions in English prisons of the time that ensured inmates would not live too long. Roger Williams was not a pioneer in preaching the biblical doctrine of the separation of church and state. Among his most notable predecessors was Arnold of Brescia, who was burned alive at the stake in Rome in 1155. The Polish reformer Jan Laski, not to be confused with his contemporary Catholic dignitary, also preached this doctrine and was persecuted, this time by the Lutherans.
The intellectual tradition derived from Augustine, who had justified death for unyielding heretics, and Aquinas, who had argued that the sin of heresy was so great that heretics deserve not only to be separated from the Church by excommunication, but also to be shut off from the world by death. Once in power, neither Luther nor Calvin had disputed this. As a result, by the time Williams wrote, hundreds of thousands of Christians had been slaughtered by other Christians because of the way they worshipped Christ. The first significant formal agreement came in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, allowed the local ruler in each principality of the Holy Roman Empire to determine whether his subjects were Lutheran or Catholic. But even the agreement applied only to Catholics and Lutherans and excluded Calvinists.
Protestant England didn't like when someone disrupted the orderly and pious lives of its citizens with revolutionary ideas. That's why the reformer Roger Williams decided to set out for the new English colonies in America, to seek the freedom he longed for. He sailed to America, and after a long, exhausting, and very dangerous journey, he reached Massachusetts in North America. But here he jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. The problem was that there was no real freedom in the American colonies either. Calvinist John Winthrop was the first and long-serving governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It didn't take long before Williams drew the intense and sincere attention of Winthrop. However, it was the kind of attention a fat tomcat shows when he spots a mouse in the corner of a room. And here is the Puritan monument in the United States. This monument gives a faint idea of the nuances of life in Puritan America. Just take a look at it. I get the impression that this pious gentleman looks like the love child of Darth Vader from Star Wars and Saruman from The Lord of the Rings. Knowing myself, I wouldn't have lasted long in such a whacked-out colony. This guy, once he runs you over and tramples you, will finish you off by whacking you in the head with his heavy Bible and then, in a loud and somber voice, tell you that you're a sinner. And what is the sure and just fate of such sinners? Eternal roasting in hell. It's too much to conceive. By the way, this is an unbiblical and shameful doctrine inherited from Catholicism and earlier from Greek mythology. It portrays God as a tyrant and a sadist. The creator of this doctrine is a certain fallen angel who, with great consistency, attributes to the creator his own traits. John Calvin was a gloomy man. Everything around him was sinful and came from Satan. Everything that brought joy in life came from the evil one. How fortunate that Johann Sebastian Bach was a Lutheran. If he had been a Calvinist, his masterpieces would never have come into existence. The St. John and St. Matthew Passions, the Brandenburg Concertos, the marvelous cantatas, and his organ works. In the New World, all forms of entertainment not aligned with the idea of a pious life were forbidden. Playing chess, dice, and cards were banned. Loud singing, especially joyful singing, non-devotional songs, and inappropriate ways of spending the Holy Sunday were also prohibited. Naturally, inappropriate literary and poetic creation was forbidden as well. After all, who needs poetry? It's the devil's invention. Interestingly, both Roger Williams and John Winthrop shared a belief in the Bible as the infallible Word of God, and in the imminent return of Christ to earth. For the former, the Bible was a book of freedom. For the latter, it was a tool of oppression.
Williams desired to bring himself as close to God as possible, and so he sought return to a form of worship most like early Christianity. To define this worship, he turned to Scripture. When several men and women who believed in adult baptism appeared in Providence, he joined them getting himself rebaptized, and then co-founding the First Baptist Church.
Governor John Winthrop built his city on a hill. In accordance with the theories of Augustine and John Calvin. For Williams, this was unacceptable. In this splendid city on a hill, this new Jerusalem of Winthrop, his admirers, his supporters, and his fanatical successors, improper books and publications were fervently burnt. Williams's books went up in smoke too, but this wasn't just about burning objects. No, that would be too simple. They were burning the inappropriate thoughts of the authors. George Orwell, in his book 1984, coined a perfect term for it. Thought crime. Disgusting, subversive, provocative, shameful, and threatening to the imagination of innocent, pious little sheep. Very bad thoughts, ideas, claims, notions, conclusions, projects, reflections, intentions, dreams. These fanatics would have gladly burnt the authors themselves. The disobedient were punished by whipping, branding, cutting off ears, being dragged for miles behind horses, and even being sent back to England. And in the Crown, the so-called High Commission served them more torture and death. Don't you think that's a little strange? After all, those Protestant colonies in New England were founded by separatists, the very ones who fled their country to escape persecution by the National Church of England.
Puritans in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Haven laws all stated, if any person committed adultery with a married or espoused wife, the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death. Liberty, in the view of Winthrop and his fellow magistrates, in the view of Massachusetts clergy, and in the view of most Massachusetts freemen, was the liberty to live a life which the magistrates defined as good and godly. And it was the responsibility of government to see to it that a godly life was lived. Anything outside the rules was severely punished. Winthrop's way, the magistrate's way, God's way.
John Winthrop, in his famous speech in the Massachusetts colony in 1630, summarized his goals. Our colony will be like a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. A city upon a hill is a theocracy, the rule of God carried out by his representatives here on earth. This is essentially based on Augustine's idea of the city of God, the building of God's kingdom on earth. The methods were, by principle, meant to be righteous, and at the same time, hellishly draconian. According to Winthrop's words, this wonderful city upon a hill would be so pure and elevated that all the people of the world would envy us, and then they would follow our example. But, unfortunately, anyone who is not pure, elevated, and pious enough will have no right to live in this world. Dead flies cause the ointment of apothecary to send forth a stinking savour. The American President Ronald Reagan quoted Winthrop in his speeches, precisely this fragment. Reagan was the first president of Protestant America who established cooperation with the papacy. Officially, this alliance was formed to overthrow communism. But it is precisely from the Reagan-John Paul II axis that the significance of Catholicism and the takeover of institutions of power in the US by people of Catholic faith began to rise. The Supreme Court, not a single Protestant. The CIA, mockingly called the Catholic Information Agency, became the Catholic Agency of Surveillance. The fall of communism achieved several goals at once. Recently, I watched Donald Trump's inaugural address. And you know what? He too referenced Winthrop's speech. He also claimed a golden age for the world was beginning. He too is building a city upon a hill, a city of God. And he is also an admirer of the blue laws. Exactly the same laws that were in effect in the American Puritan colonies, where the church pointed to the state who was a good citizen and who was not. In general, at first the state punished heretics. Then the terminology changed, and other groups were punished. Later, they started going after terrorists. In truth, the name is just a functional label. Whoever holds the power defines who belongs to the wrong group. Indeed, a new era is beginning for the world.
Puritans, despite their conflicts with the English hierarchy, considered themselves fully congregants of the Church of England. Now, on this wild Atlantic shore, amid the tall green seagrass waving in the dunes, with all of a whole new boundless world to share, Englishmen, Protestants, offered death to other Englishmen, also Protestants.
John Calvin was personally involved in the burning of Michael Servetus at the stake. Along with him, his books were also burned. The old rule goes, where they burn books, they will soon burn people too. Calvin even wrote a defense of killing heretics. The French Inquisition had hunted Servetus much earlier, but in the end it was the Protestant Council of Geneva and Calvin who got him. A great advocate for freedom of conscience was the English poet John Milton, who even met the famous Hugo Grotius. Grotius, in turn, was a Dutch lawyer and statesman who promoted the biblical principle of freedom of conscience. But even the most tolerant of Protestants, the Dutch, sentenced him to death. Protestant England was not tolerant either. Not at all. Thomas Helwys, a separatist, someone who rejected the Church of England, wrote his Confession of Faith in 1611. He declared, "Rulers must not unite with religion, nor force people to follow any particular form of faith." One wonders what he would say about the modern world. Helwys died in 1616 in Newgate, a prison not far from the home of young Roger Williams. No voice was raised in Parliament to defend any Protestant group. Among them were also congregations observing the true biblical Sabbath, Saturday. The prevailing mindset was solely focused on the idea of a national church, universal and state-sanctioned. Its decisions were strict and infallible. Thus, we see that Protestantism very quickly became the same authoritarian apparatus of violence as Roman Catholicism. But Protestantism had potential. At its core, it replaces secular authorities regulating faith with the voice of conscience, and replaces a visible church with a central censor with the authority of God's Word. Protestantism is based solely on the Bible, the true Protestantism, that is. Roger Williams was an outstanding scholar of the Bible, and therefore understood perfectly who the only author and guarantor of liberty is. The ways of the Almighty are unfathomable. What Martin Luther started but neglected had to be proclaimed by someone else, and that someone turned out to be Roger Williams. John Winthrop and the other Puritan officials came to hate him very quickly. Their hatred was hellish and their determination unrelenting. They were irritated even by the shadow of Williams passing by. But Roger had had enough. He felt he had hit a wall. There is a time to be silent and a time to speak, and Williams was just getting started.
Roger Williams had seen enough of power. He clearly had no desire to direct other men's lives. He had even less desire to be directed by others.
Even if Massachusetts was not a theocracy, it was certainly theocentric. The entire week was filled with church ceremonies. On Sundays, there were 2 services, each lasting well over 3 hours. Attendance was mandatory. Throughout the entire time, every believer was expected to stay focused. Sleeping or pretending to be engaged was out of the question. The most important figures of the church and magistrate never forgot that their goal was to build a new Jerusalem, a city upon a hill, the kingdom of God on earth, where every citizen was a good and disciplined person, and woe to anyone who dared interfere with that. These people worked in perfect harmony to build such a pious utopia on earth, free from moral decay. They defined it as a society that strictly obeys God, and God speaks to them through the mouths of their leaders. And they were quite successful in building this great holy utopia, but they had one very serious problem. That problem lay at the very heart of their earthly paradise. That problem was named Roger Williams. It was much worse than they expected. They demanded oaths of loyalty even from the most immoral. Williams opposed this. He preached that forcing people to be pious is a violation of God's commandment, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," because it amounts to mass-producing hypocrites and liars. Taxes for the church were mandatory, with no appeal. Any statements or jokes that deviated from accepted norms were punished by the magistrate. Roger Williams based his views on this idea. God wrote the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets. The reformer asked why he didn't write everything on just 1. The reason is that the first tablet contains commandments 1 through 4, which relate to a person's relationship with God. The second tablet contains 6 commandments that regulate relationships between people. Williams taught that the commandments on the first tablet pertain solely to the individual's relationship with God, and no secular government has the right to interfere. Winthrop insisted that these are state laws and people can be punished, for example, for profaning Sunday.
The preachers were not to hold office in itself, but they were to be the rulers of all who did. For, as no man could be a citizen unless he was a member of the church, and as none could become members of the churches or even propounded to the congregation, except they be first allowed by the elders, this was to make the preachers supreme. This is exactly the position they occupied. They were consulted in everything, and everything must be subject to their dictation.
I've also encountered this exact mentality among pastors in a certain modern Protestant church. It's nothing new. They believe they stand above the flock. And the duty of the sheep is to humbly bring them a tithe based on gross income. This is a classic process where a caste of scribes and bishops is formed. Preachers who were supposed to spread the gospel become parish priests living in the rectory. In such a system, a central treasury is created and the faithful send money there. It's not the congregation that pays the preacher. Therefore, the headquarters can control what the pastor does and says. He says what he's told to say and avoids saying anything against the central line. Simple? Very simple. It's a corporate church, a typical corporation. If you listen to modern pastors, they speak exactly like papal encyclicals or Pope Francis himself. Papal social thought, an absurd vision of ecclesiastical Marxism where there is no private property and no national borders. Let those poor people in. Share your wealth. Obey health authorities. The climate will kill us. We need great change. Don't criticize anyone. Love each other. Unite. They constantly drone on about love like the Beatles. I stopped listening. If I want to hear a mosquito buzzing, I'll go to some swamp. Of course, there are exceptions. Even in the desert of apostasy, there will always remain the last righteous ones.
Hear the word of the Lord, ye that tremble at his word. Your brethren that hated you, that cast you out for my name's sake, said, Let the Lord be glorified. But he shall appear to your joy, and they shall be ashamed.
Roger Williams treated the Indians with great respect, and they returned his feelings. The Puritans had no success evangelizing the Indians. Native Americans saw what was happening in English colonies. They saw how the Puritans treated each other and others, and they had no desire to be a part of it. Additionally, Christianity never became popular among Native Americans because it was the religion of the invaders, and the invaders weren't cool. However, Roger Williams created a clear model to follow. He learned their languages and was often the only white person the local tribal leaders were willing to speak with. They trusted him. The reformer preached that nature does not distinguish between Europeans and Indians. He cited Acts 17, where Paul, speaking in Athens at the Areopagus, said that God made all nations of humanity from one blood. What a beautiful alternative to that old racist theory of Charles Darwin.
In January 1636, a warrant was sent to Williams to come to Boston and to take ship for England. He refused to go. Officers were sent in a boat to bring him, but he was gone. 3 days before, he had left Salem in winter snow and inclement weather, of which he remembered the severity even in his late old age. For 14 weeks he was sorely tossed in a bitter season, not knowing what bread or bed did mean. Often in the stormy night he had neither fire nor food nor company. Often he wandered without a guide, and he had no house but a hollow tree. But he was not without friends. The respect for the rights of others, which had led him to defend the freedom of conscience, had made him the champion of the Indians. He had learned their language during his residence at Plymouth. He had often been the guest of the neighbouring Sachems. And now, when he came in winter to the cabin of the chief of Poconoet, he was welcomed by Massasoit, and the barbarous heart of Canonicus, the chief of the Narragansetts, loved him as his son to the last gasp. The ravens, he relates, fed me in the wilderness.
Roger Williams learned Native American dialects while living in Plymouth, and now the time had finally come for him to achieve what he had fought for all his life. That unfortunate winter escape from the authorities of the Puritan colonies became the catalyst for great change. Roger Williams was enchanted by the lands known today as Rhode Island. However, these vast lands belonged to Native American tribes. Negotiations began. He loved the Indians, and they loved him. Roger Williams bought the land in Rhode Island from the Native Americans for the official market price. This man was impeccably honest. But that greatly scandalized the American Protestants. Giving money to savages, as they called them, did not align with their value system. Why buy something when you can simply take it by force? And now Roger Williams's great dream has come true. In the colony of Rhode Island, everyone could believe in whatever they wanted. There was a place for atheists and persecuted Quakers alike. Moreover, many Puritans from nearby colonies moved to Rhode Island, tired of the constant interference in their lives by Puritan guardians of morality and pious customs. Roger Williams created the only oasis of freedom in the entire world. Even the Dutch in New Amsterdam, present-day New York, 300 kilometers away, looked at his experiment with growing disapproval. Let's remember, these were the same Dutch who had suffered terrible persecution from Catholic rulers in Spain. Yet, once Protestants gained freedom of conscience for themselves, they immediately denied it to anyone who disagreed with their rigid dogma. Unfortunately, that was the standard of the time. The Rhode Island colony became a thorn in the side of Puritans from neighboring colonies. They gathered forces to finally destroy this nest of ideas they so deeply despised. But times had changed. The English monarchy faltered. Those who had once been persecuted in England became very powerful. The existence of the Rhode Island colony was now possible because the balance of power had shifted. Catholic King Charles I of the Stuart dynasty was beheaded for waging a brutal war against Protestantism and attempting to re-Catholicize the country. The apparatus of repression, the High Commission, was disbanded. Suddenly Williams had very influential friends. One of them was none other than the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, who always liked and respected Williams. The Rhode Island colony received an official document confirming its legal status, along with Cromwell's blessing. American Puritans were furious, but they had to grit their teeth. No one dared to challenge Cromwell. Once, upon hearing of the persecution of the Waldensians in Piedmont, he said that if the Papists didn't stop killing them, they would hear his cannons at the Vatican. France's chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, was said to turn pale at the mere mention of Cromwell's name. Cromwell was feared throughout Catholic Europe. It is widely believed that his Protestant cavalry, the Ironsides, was unbeatable. Since the Battle of Marston Moor, he hadn't lost a single battle. Unfortunately, he didn't live long. Rumors circulated that he had been poisoned. After his death, as part of the effort to restore Roman Catholicism, the Protestant England of 1661 saw the return of the Stuart king, Charles II, who ordered Cromwell's corpse to be dug up, his head cut off, and mounted on a spike. For many years it was displayed in public. Oliver Cromwell's skull looked down on the streets of London from the roof of Westminster Hall. Then it vanished. Maryland, which was under Catholic rule, provided more freedom than the other colonies, apart from Rhode Island, of course. However, even there, just as in William Penn's Pennsylvania, tolerance applied only to people who professed Christian faith. Roger Williams's Rhode Island was a special place, and it was from there that the wind of true freedom reached the founders of the United States, was written down on paper, and became law. And here we have John Wesley, another long-haired reformer. Have you ever seen a long-haired pope? So grow out your hair. Unless, of course, you've already lost it, then grow a beard. Unless you want to be boring, in which case, just keep your hair short. Okay, that was just a dry joke. I'd better take a sip of water. In the second half of the 18th century, persecution of those who went against the grain could be brutally real. In Georgia, the repressive system of church-state union functioned at least until 1737, and it manifested in the persecution faced by John Wesley and the Methodist Church. The persecutors were Protestants. An angry mob, armed with clubs, cleavers, and other potentially deadly tools, chased Wesley and his companions. As Jake Hansen wrote in his book Crossing the Divide, Wesley was often stoned, smeared with manure, pulled by the hair and driven into houses that the attackers intended to burn or destroy. Methodist worship services were disrupted by setting their chapels on fire or driving herds of cows or pigs into them, and this was already the mid-18th century. So despite the passage of time, this spirit of hostility toward any new doctrine had not disappeared from the world. I'm afraid that it will only take a spark for the old fire of persecution to ignite once again.
Blue laws in place, and so many things were shut down, and how frustrating that was for a child. And yet now I look back on that and I think, what a gift those laws were.
Thus, in addition to ensuring justice in our civil relations, civil authority can regulate the Sabbath day, for example, to remove those daily cares and concerns that distract us from Sunday worship.
You have such power, but you weren't allowed to use that power, and you're now allowed to use it. I get in there, you're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before. It's going to bring back the churchgoer. I mean, you have to see, I don't like the charts when I see charts where they're going in the wrong direction. We don't like that. We're going to bring it back, and I really believe it's the biggest thing missing from this country. It's the biggest thing missing. We have to bring back our religion. We have to bring back Christianity in this country. You're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before. You're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before.
All these events I've spoken about have a deep meaning and a proper sequence. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century did not bring about a complete renewal. Biblical truths were scattered across the world among individuals and small groups of believers. A bit here, a bit there. There was no way to unite them into one church, as this simply wasn't possible in Europe under the watchful eye of the papacy. The only country where this goal could be truly realized was the United States of America. It was a land isolated from the rest of the world and protected by legal acts that guaranteed freedom of conscience. This was the great life's work of Roger Williams, and it was precisely in America, this stronghold of religious freedom, that in the mid-19th century, a man named William Miller, a Baptist, arose. He drew attention to the prophecies of the Bible and proclaimed the date of Christ's return to be the year 1844.
Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed.
Miller discovered the starting date of the prophecy, the year 457 BC, which corresponds to the decree of Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem. Let me remind you that the original decree of Cyrus concerned only the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Therefore, the decree of Artaxerxes from 457 BC is the direct fulfillment of the prophecy from Daniel chapter 9. As it later turned out, Miller mistakenly assumed that the sanctuary mentioned in the prophecy referred to the earth. As a result of the great disappointment, since Jesus did not return to the earth at the appointed time, attention was turned to a forgotten truth, the existence of the true sanctuary in heaven, and the beginning of the judgment hour. From the great body of Millerites, only a small group remained, those who began to preach other forgotten biblical truths. For example, the truth about the true day of God, the biblical Sabbath, Saturday. This group consisted of former Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians. They were not tolerated in their own churches, so they began to meet among themselves. And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church was born, a church that holds the entire biblical truth, at least on paper. Whether it preaches the message it was called to deliver is another matter entirely. In this church, you will find the doctrines once taught by Martin Luther, Andreas Helvig, Karlstadt, the Anabaptists, Balthasar Hubmaier, John Hus, Roger Williams, John Wesley, and others. It is the culmination of the work of the Reformation. The Bible presents a clear principle. Where God's law is trampled, the gifts of the Holy Spirit do not appear, including the gift of prophecy. The reason is simple. If people reject the very truth that underlies God's government, He cannot entrust them with His gifts.
Where there is no vision, the people perish. But he that keepeth the law, happy is he. The Lord has proposed to destroy the wall of the daughter of Zion. Her gates are sunk into the ground. He hath destroyed and broken her bars. Her king and her princes are among the Gentiles. The law is no more. Her prophets also find no vision from the Lord.
When attention was drawn to the fact that the 10 Commandments are still binding, the gift of the spirit of prophecy appeared in this church in the person of Ellen G. White. Some claim this is impossible. However, God has always raised up people before every major event in world history. People who warned the world of the impending catastrophe. Always. It's hard to imagine that He would appoint no one at all before the end of the earth's history. All those truly great people I've told you about longed for peace and a quiet life, yet their daily experience was mockery, scourging, as well as chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two, burned at the stake, becoming a spectacle for kings, clergy, and the common crowd. They were tested, killed by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, suffering need, oppression, and hardship, people of whom the world was not worthy. They roamed deserts and mountains, lived in caves and holes in the ground. But the history of this world, a place of suffering, persecution, oppression, tears, and despair, is drawing to a close, approaching its dramatic finale. And finally, the time will come when they will receive their inheritance, their eternal home. Jan Hus, Martin Luther, Hugo Grotius, Karlstadt, Jan Lasky, Johann Huth, Balthasar Hubmaier, Roger Williams, John Wesley, and all those throughout the ages who believed in the truth and remained steadfast.
I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him.